It's one of those hidden organs. Maybe someone can wrongly assume that because someone superficially appears healthy with a six-pack or just looks in shape, or they even train a lot, that they maybe are healthy and have a healthy gut.
We've kind of been led to believe that if you want better skin, take a probiotic. Cure your IBS, take a probiotic.
When it comes to any sort of supplement, whether it's a multivitamin or even a probiotic, they are powerful chemicals, they're powerful drugs.
Essentially, we've just been using them incorrectly. They can be hugely powerful, but we haven't been translating the science into the marketplace.
But this also opens the doors to charlatans and pseudoscientists to see this as a way to monetize and make money on something which is trendy, but then offering something which doesn't really offer health but offers more hype. Dr. Megan Rossi, you are known online as the gut health doctor. Now, I know why you love gut health because I do too, but I want to know why the focus on gut health for you.
Look, it began around 15 or so years ago when I was in my final year studying nutrition and dietetics, and I lost my grandma to bowel cancer. And, I'm certainly not alone in that. It's one of the third biggest cancer killer in the world. And I think it just hit me really hard because, my grandma had a really big role in my upbringing. My mom was a single mom working full time, and then we lost my sister when she was 5. So I really lent on my grandma. She was one of the closest people to me. So I hated this organ who put her through the chemo and the surgery and obviously taking her life. I was so angry. And then I graduated and started working as a clinical dietitian in the hospital setting, all different types of conditions, kidney disease, heart disease, different cancers. But I was also quite fortunate to be the nutritionist for the Australian Olympic synchronized swimming team. And it really was that observation of seeing elite athletes and very sick people both coming to me complaining of that organ again that I hated. I was like, what is going on? And that was around 2010. So there hadn't been a whole lot of gut health research really come to the forefront. There's little murmurs in the literature. So I thought, you know what? I owe it to my grandma, to my patients, clients to find out more about this. So that's when I embarked on the PhD in gut health. And honestly, it just completely changed my relationship with the gut. I was like, wow. I am sorry for all the swear words I threw at you, gut. Like, you were just misunderstood. And I knew that I could help people improve their lives in very real, but often surprising ways because of this landmark scientific discovery that is the gut microbiome.
I think there's a huge misunderstanding about gut health, not just many of the things we'll come to talk about, but it's one of those hidden organs. And maybe someone can wrongly assume that because someone superficially appears healthy with a six-pack or just looks in shape, or they even train a lot, that they maybe are healthy and have a healthy gut. And, similar to the story with your grandmother, I had a very close friend of mine who was a personal trainer when I used to live in London, and he used to be my personal trainer. And he was very fit, like would work out 6-7 times a week, sometimes even twice a day. But actually, he didn't really take care of other aspects in his life, one being gut health. I mean, his diet was all over the place. And unfortunately, he passed away from advanced stage 4 bowel cancer a few months back. And for me, that was also another wake-up call to be like, just because you're healthy doesn't mean you're immune from all these things. And, bad luck happens, genetic mutations, all these things happen. But actually, what we can do is one of the few things we can do and control from our end is our gut health.
Absolutely. And again, that's what I think I've fallen in love with this space because it's so empowering, right? Like, we can't change our genetics, right? But we can change our gut microbiome to a large extent. Yes, about 5 to 10% might be genetically related, but the rest of it and the science is exploding. Like, gut health is so much more than just digestive health diseases like colon cancer, inflammatory bowel disease. Obviously, they're the ones that people focus on, but we're now highlighting, through really robust clinical trials that actually mental health, hormone regulation, even fitness goals, all of these sorts of things can be impacted by our gut microbes. So like you said, it's all about empowering everyone with the science, not the kind of all the cloud and confusion that I think often comes with the landmark scientific discovery when people on social media try to translate it, and often in quite a confusing way and with missed messages.
Okay, and a few quickfire questions, and I want to come into them in a bit more detail later on. Will prioritizing your gut health help you lose weight without cutting calories?
Absolutely can. Yeah, we've got meta-analyses to prove that.
And where do you stand on probiotics?
Oh, I'm very passionate about this one. And essentially, we've just been using them incorrectly. They can be hugely powerful, but we haven't been translating the science into the marketplace. And that gap is really, I think, preventing people from getting the clinical benefits we see in randomized controlled trials around probiotics.
Thoughts on colostrum?
Look, it's got a role, but I wouldn't necessarily think we need to start taking it.
Fermented foods, they've been a big buzz right now. They're easy to make at home. What are your favorites?
I'm a huge fan of kefir, kombucha, and kimchi. Although I want to highlight, I think fermented foods and probiotics are very different. And often people that talk about them intertwined, where actually I don't think that's necessarily helpful when we look at the clinical studies. But you're right, actually fermented foods, thousands of years old, but it's got this new kind of found love and actually some clinical data to show it can really help with our gut health.
So that's definitely something I want to touch on a lot more, because I think there is a lot of confusion about probiotics versus probiotic foods, fermented foods. And, as you said rightly, both can have and maybe should have a place in everyone's life, but there's certain caveats and nuances that we should talk about. Now, everyone looks at the gut as this thing which forms feces from our food and then chucks it out. What is actually going on inside our guts right now, and why is it so crucial just beyond gut health?
Yeah, look, I mean, hundreds of different functions, right? And I think it's quite humbling to the human ego, where we used to think we were in control of, everything going on in our body. But actually, thanks to the discovery of the microbiome, we now realize a lot of them are really, pulling the strings to some extent. So things like, recycling estrogen is happening in our gut. Microbes are producing vitamin K2 in our gut. They're also metabolizing and breaking down the fiber, producing these things called short chain fatty acids, which I think more people are talking about, which have got so many benefits to it, including things like regulating appetite, but also kind of quenching the inflammation that we're all exposed to kind of just from being human and living our lives.
Why has the microbial population changed over time? And is it our fault? Have we domesticated our microbes too much? Or what's going on there?
So we aren't making things from scratch. We are having these ultra processed foods, which not only contain less of these kind of fertilizers for our microbiomes, things like these phytochemicals, but actually because it's so processed and goes through all this kind of sterilization, actually, things like an apple no longer contain as many different microbes on them. And I think that's a really, exciting new space of research where we're looking at not just obviously the phytochemical, the chemicals within a food, right? But actually we're looking at their microbial profile. So I think, we're all talking about fermented foods like, oh yes, it's got the live microbes in it. But a lot of people don't realize that pick an apple from a tree, it's got like 100 million bacteria on it, right? And you look at all the different plants and naturally, they will have their own microbial profile. But then if we go and ultra process it and sterilize it, those microbes have all been killed. So I think, that's going to have a huge role to play. We're not fertilizing our microbes. And then like you highlighted, it's things like the soil. We've become so ultra clean and sterile, these alcohol gels, which obviously have a role, particularly during COVID, it's so important for good hygiene. But I kind of talk about good dirt and bad dirt. Like if you're in London on the tube, yes, use the alcohol gels, right? But if you're out in the forest and having dirt on your hands, then actually just rinsing your hands. You don't need to scrub them with soap and things like that. There's some really cool research around that where people who have been playing in the soil, kind of, healthy, natural soil, not like ultra chemicals and fertilized. And actually, if they just washed their hands and then ate and that sort of thing versus, really scrubbing, and that actually they had more diverse microbes in them than those who didn't kind of play in the soil. These factors are all going to have an impact on why, we see from kind of the observational studies that we have lost some microbial diversity.
So it looks like we've moved away from that initial hygiene hypothesis where actually, the super clean, sterile environment is the one that's caused this, to then the update of that being the old friends hypothesis that actually it is good to have some bugs, but there are also some bad bugs. And again, I feel there's two camps with this, maybe influenced by social media. There's that one camp which still feels that everything is bad and we should sterilize it and maybe doesn't fully understand the role of the microbiome. And then the other camp, which maybe accepts the role of the microbiome, but goes the other way and then won't accept any sort of pasteurization, sterilization when it's required, cleanliness, hand hygiene. And in some cases, that can be quite harmful as well. I mean, it's really interesting how, it's a delicate balance, that we have to accept that there are good bugs and bad bugs. And yes, you should maybe, like you said, encourage your kids or, even yourself to go out and play in nature on the soil, but you don't need to, undergo sort of a biohazard decontamination after that event.
Absolutely. I mean, there's always kind of this temptation for extremists, right? And I think, yeah, it can be dangerous either side. But I think there needs to be a fundamental shift. I think the average person, yes, there are extremists, I think, on social, but the average person, certainly as a mum, I've seen it in the mums group, are still over hygienic with their kids, where, we'll be in the forest and they'll fall on the dirt and like, oh my God, quick, get the sterilizer out and things like that. And I'm like, this really is feeding into the research around, we know that first 1,000 days of life is so, so important for the establishment of the kids' microbiome. And we certainly see it. I'm fortunate. I grew up on a farm in Australia, so I kind of benefited from that. And again, the science is showing that if you grow up on a farm, playing in the dirt with all the animals, all that sort of stuff, you have a lower risk of allergies, things like asthma, but also actually obesity. So I think it's so important that education happens very accurately. But you're right, without that extremist of let's start, doing things like fecal microbial transplants without any clinical data behind it. And hopefully we'll get into that topic of FMTs, because it's so fascinating in terms of like where it's come from and how it therapeutically can be really beneficial in very specific spaces. But actually, we might be transplanting things like, depression and anxiety if things are not done properly, right? And there are private clinics in London already advertising this for like IBS when the data is so sketchy.
Too soon, yeah. We often hear a lot, more and more these days, that diversity is good for the gut. Diversity of foods, diversity of things in general, and exposure to different environments are good. But still, there's a lot of people influenced by diet culture that cut out things they don't need to, whether it's gluten, sugar, dairy, all of these things. And there may be some cultural reasons or personal reasons for those things, but sometimes I feel that people are cutting things out to their detriment. So first of all, why is diversity good for the gut?
Yeah. So, I mean, this is a really good one to touch on, because there was that landmark paper, which I think a lot of people, refer to from the American Gut team, where they were the first ones to look at, I guess, people who ate more different types of plants and microbial diversity. And they showed that, yes, if you had, 30 plus, then you had more different microbes than if you ate the same 10 on repeat. So it was kind of, that was, the first observational study that brought this as a concept. And then, looking, I guess, mechanistically, we know that actually each species of plants got different types of phytochemicals, which feed different types of microbes. So it all makes a lot of sense, right? But I think it's probably important to highlight that there still hasn't been a randomized control trial. So our team at King's is very fortunate. The government saw this as an area of need and actually have funded a grant where we are going to run a randomized control trial to look at this concept of diversity. So high diverse diet versus low diverse diet, match for dietary fiber, and actually look, okay, well, should we be changing our national guidelines? Because very much at the moment, it's saying fruit and veg. Like, it's missing out on what I call the super six. So things like your whole grains, your legumes, chickpeas, butter beans, your nuts and your seeds, your herbs and your spices, the other categories, which again, mechanistically, we know have got different types of phytochemicals in it. So, I think this area is really exciting. I think at the moment, yes, let's all focus on diversity, but, let's watch this space in terms of where the clinical data comes out. And the nuances, I'm sure there'll be plenty around that in terms of portion size, all that sort of stuff. But at the moment, yes, going for diversity is quite important.
Yeah, it's quite funny that we traditionally associate fiber with fruit and vegetables, and got to give Dr. Emily Leeming props for this. I mean, she has that little acronym BGs: beans, greens, berries, grains, and nuts and seeds, S for seeds. And a lot of people maybe don't associate with all those other things with sources of fiber, and they just think of green salads and vegetables like carrots and things like that. And that, that's great. if someone does eat all those things and 5 a day of those things. But there's so many other easier lifts in an everyday life to include more fiber, like, just throw some sunflower seeds onto your salad and you've doubled your kind of sources of fiber.
100%. And actually, there was a great study from Bergen University, which I think hit home this concept of trying to get in the super six, so 6 different categories of plants, where they actually showed that adding legumes to your diet had the greatest effect in terms of increasing longevity. I think it was about by 2.5 years, if we could all start adding a cup of legumes to our diet. And actually, that was a greater effect than if we were to eat more fruit and veg. Now, not to prioritize and say, well, legume fiber or legume polyphenols, all that sort of stuff are better. It's just, I think it's an easier gain because most of us have kind of just completely ignored that category of plants because it's not drilled in, right? So yeah, absolutely. I think we just need to get in that mindset of thinking, have you had something from the Super Six today? If not, chuck a can of mixed beans, like you said, some nuts or seeds on a salad, all that sort of stuff. It's just so easy to do once you're empowered with that information, right? There's so much convincing research now that, if you are cutting out foods unnecessarily, then actually that can have a negative impact on the microbiome, including gluten, right? So gluten, I think, has been unfairly demonized. It's a protein. Yes, if you've got celiac disease, obviously you need to be super strict, right? Because it's like a peanut allergy where your body associates that as a toxin and then it has all this inflammation, right? So you need to be super strict for life. Although they are looking at doing some vaccines, so maybe in the future there'll be kind of a treatment, but fingers crossed. But for now, super strict. But what they've shown is people who are excluding gluten who don't have celiac disease or those with non-celiac gluten sensitivity, which we think is probably only like maybe 3 to 6% of people. So not that many people, but everyone else, if they are unnecessarily cutting out gluten, then they seem to have a decrease in their microbial diversity. And I think it's important to highlight, it's not that gluten is like this amazing prebiotic, right? It's just the fact that things like your wheat, barley, and rye contain prebiotics called fructans, which nourish that microbiome. So it's kind of, that's what people don't necessarily realize is cutting out one thing can have these unexpected consequences.
Also, on a similar point, things like dairy as well. I mean, sure, there's a whole cohort of people who are vegans and, for ethical reasons, they may not want to have any dairy sources. But, dairy, if you just look at fermented dairy like kefir or even normal dairy products, they obviously contain prebiotics like galacto-oligosaccharides, which we know are so potent for modulating the microbiome. So I guess when people do restrict all those things, they're not just restricting the calories or the food or something they think is bad, but actually hidden within those are really powerful phytochemicals and prebiotics, which nourish the microbiome and actually improve health outcomes. And you may not see it, but it quietly just supports your immune system, improves your, metabolic disease risk and all of these various things. And those are from so-called bad foods.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a huge fan of fermented dairy. And I think, this whole movement away that, dairy is toxic, I think that one needs to be busted for sure. And I guess, again, completely understand why someone would want to cut it out. But I think a lot of people I see in clinic where they are cutting out dairy because they have lactose intolerance, which is quite common. And I'm sure you're, very aware in certain cultural or backgrounds. But I think people don't necessarily realize that actually, things like your hard cheeses and actually kefir contain, or hard cheeses contain negligible amounts because it's all been kind of drained away in the process. But things like kefir typically contain about 30% less lactose than your, standard milk. And the other thing that's more important is actually you can train your microbiome to help, break down that lactose. So you don't contain enough of the lactase enzymes to break down that milk sugar lactose, but actually your microbes can start to do that for you. So, it's about having your 50 mils or, of the kefir or yogurt each day, and you can build it up. And I see it in clinic, and it can be really powerful where people, are now having foods that, firstly, they really enjoy. And I think it's so hard to cut out foods they really enjoy, but also that we know have been associated with, many health benefits.
Yeah, I was really interested in this topic a while back, and I just went on a little bit of a rabbit hole. And, this obviously, as when we're born, we have that lactase enzyme given by our mothers to help us digest the lactose from the breast milk. And we lose the lactase enzyme as we age. We sort of, lose that power. But in some populations, they still have a higher rate of retaining that lactase enzyme, that lactase persistence phenotype. And I think it's usually Northern European populations typically, are less likely to be lactose intolerant, and higher rates of lactose intolerance in Africa and parts of South Asia as well. But funnily enough, I've just noticed anecdotally that more people are lactose intolerant as adults in the Western world than in other parts of the world. Like, when I go to India, most people in India and even in Africa, they drink and eat a lot of dairy. And those are populations which should have higher rates of lactose intolerance and less lactase enzyme persistence. And I guess it comes down to that microbiome modulation, that colonic adaptation, because they're basically forcing their guts to adapt to this huge lactose load. The microbes just become more efficient and say, hey, we got to survive. Let's just figure out how to digest, this lactose again. So if someone wanting to, reduce their symptoms of lactose intolerance and wanted to try this colonic adaptation and training their gut to become more tolerant to lactose, what would you advise as a sort of protocol to ease themselves into that?
Yeah, so it would be starting with, again, everyone's, tolerance is different at baseline, but usually around 50 mils of, kefir, or it could be yogurt. I prefer to have fermented dairy because it's got these additional benefits compared to just standard milk. But if you prefer to have milk, go for that. So start with a 50 mils each day and see how your gut feels. If you can, the second week, increase it to, by 25, so 75 mils. And again, it's all about seeing your tolerance level. Now, if you get a little bit of a gut, that's okay. That's kind of your microbes being trained. So don't freak out. And I mean, the same goes with a lot of, issues with beans, for example, chickpeas, butter beans and stuff like that. The exact same protocol occurs where a lot of people struggle with them, particularly if they've got a sensitive gut, something like, irritable bowel syndrome. But absolutely, you can train your gut using that same protocol in terms of starting with 1 tablespoon next week, have per day. Next week, have 2 tablespoons a day and build it up. But then, listening to your body. So some people might go, oh, today was a bit much because maybe you've eaten something else that was a bit more, spicy or something. So then you would cut it down to half. So it's kind of listening to your body, but kind of pushing it. And actually, it's very much like the gym, right? When you're working out the gym, like you want to feel a bit of a burn because you're working on your muscles. The same kind of goes with training your gut around these different food intolerances. You want to feel a bit of something because it's like, yeah, they're working. Those microbes are learning. But obviously you don't want to go to a level where actually you can't walk for a week at the gym. The same goes with your microbes.
On that topic, I guess a very common GI symptom is bloating. I think a lot of people experience it, but the number of different causes of bloating are as long as your arm, and people can experience a full spectrum of bloating. And, you've spoken quite a bit about this. What is actually going on when it comes to bloating? Because also understanding and the caveat that actually what is going on may be dependent on those different causes as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think any clinician will agree there is just so many different triggers for bloating. And, I would say that diet and lifestyle, there's about 22 different triggers that I commonly see that would be causing it. Outside, obviously, once we've ruled out celiac disease, inflammatory bowel disease, endometriosis and things like that. Yeah, so there's quite a lot, anything from, like you said, the lactose intolerance to, having uneven fiber distribution, to having too many of these sugar alcohols like polyols, wearing tight pants all the time. So that there's so many. But like you said, in terms of the underlying mechanisms of bloating, I think it typically comes down to 3, right? So when we think about fiber, so we talk about fiber, I think a lot of people appreciate that fiber is food for the microbiome. So human cells don't have the enzymes, right? So if we think when we eat the plants, which contain the fiber, it gets malabsorbed through most of our 9-meter digestive tract. So we have this 9-meter kind of tube coiled up in each and every one of us that delivers food from entry all the way to exit. Now, the most of our microbes live in that last 1.5 meters called the large intestine. So anything that doesn't get absorbed higher up like our small intestine, that long tube. Things like, most of our protein does, most of our carbs and our fat gets absorbed, right? But the fiber can't, because we don't have the enzymes, because it's too big to get from your gut to your blood, right? So it gets into that large intestine, and the microbes then break it down. And we discussed short chain fatty acids as one of these amazing byproducts that the microbes produce, which go and do things like quench the inflammation, regulate appetite, all of that sort of stuff. But one of the just natural waste products of fiber fermentation is a bit of gas, right? So that is completely normal, a little bit of gas. And that's why if you have a really high fiber diet, you might feel a little bit bloated because your microbes have produced more gas. But in terms of what I call burdensome bloating, so this is when, I think 20% of people experience when it's like you don't understand why. You didn't just have a really high fiber meal. Your friend ate the same thing. You're like, what is going on here? So like I said, 3 different things can occur. One is that you can be having excess amount of gas produced. And that could be because you just had a whole lot of fiber and your body's not used to it. So you need to train your microbes. And therefore, if you've starved them of fiber, and it could just be like one day you've just decided to have loads of fiber accidentally and usually have a very low fiber diet, then what happens, the microbes have like a binge eat and they produce all these bubbles and gas. So that's one, thing that could happen, the excess fiber. Also, excess gas. The other thing is obviously if you've got a food intolerance, like lactose intolerance, I have a whole lot of milk. Again, extra substrate, extra food for those microbes because you haven't absorbed that lactose higher up, gets into that large intestine. The microbes, again, have this frenzy and produce all this gas. So that's the first mechanism. You could be producing excess gas. The second one is that actually you could be having trapped gas. So actually the amount of gas your microbes are producing is quite normal. It's just that actually the gas is getting trapped in your gut, because a lot of the gas that our microbes produce actually goes from our gut into our bloodstream, and actually we breathe it out. And that's how breath tests work, right? So people often think that the gas all comes out the back end as flatulence, but actually that's not true. So a lot of it goes through, as well as the fact that actually we've got microbes which can actually eat some of the gas. So we've got microbes that can break that down and therefore, again, helping with things like bloating. So you can have the trapped gas, and that can happen if you have things like gut lining sensitivity. We know estrogen can really have an effect on that. So hormones and as well as things like irritable bowel syndrome, where the gut-brain connection is kind of making the gut lining really sensitive, which means the gas is not efficiently moving from your gut into your blood. So that's the second mechanism of you've just got the gas trapped in your gut. And then the third mechanism is where actually it's the fact that even a teeny amount of gas, so you could have low amounts of gas being produced, but you have, again, visceral hypersensitivity, where the gut lining is so sensitive that even a little teeny bit of natural gas or anything that you eat stretches that intestine a little bit, and that zips the messages up via the vagus nerve to your brain and says, oh, there's a lot of pain. And therefore, what happens is it means that your diaphragm kind of moves and your stomach muscles naturally relax and you get like a potted belly. So it's kind of this protective mechanism that happens. So it's kind of those 3 different mechanisms underlying why someone can have bloating. And those 22 triggers, some of them will just focus on one. They could just contribute to excess gas. Others can contribute to that sensitivity or the trapped gas. So they all kind of, feed in together in a way.
So it's such a hugely complex area in bloating, and someone should definitely try to find that root cause before jumping on to any specific treatments without identifying what's at the heart of that. And this may not be suitable for every single person, but there's increasingly a lot of data in the literature suggesting that daily consumption of fermented foods can help with not just gut health, but specific symptoms like bloating. And even though a lot of fermented foods do contain fiber and they've got rich sources of microbes in there as well, sort of probiotic rich, they also paradoxically, according to what we've said, even if you have lots of fiber and lots of microbes, they could cause more gas. Fermented foods seem to alleviate sometimes that sort of gas or cramping or bloating symptoms. What is it about fermented food that can be so beneficial for health?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good one. And I would say, again, fermented foods, it's a personalized thing. So In clinic, I do see that some people have gone a bit gung-ho with fermented foods, and actually that has contributed to bloating because their gut is not prepped for that much extra microbes and fiber and stuff like that. So totally appreciate for that. You know, if you go slow and steady and work your way up, then actually fermented foods might help relieve because it might add those microbes that help eat the gas and those sorts of things. But I would say that we just need to be cautious of, I guess, how much of the fermented food you have if you're not used to it, because it is one of the triggers. And I have that bloating masterclass where we look at those 22, and fermented foods is one of them because it is something I see in clinic. But like you said, fermented foods have got so many additional benefits to it. And I think that's why, you know, they are very different to, you know, you see these people now putting a live microbe in a soda and like, oh, it's like a fermented drink, right? But actually it skipped the very important process of that fermentation, where what happens, like if you think of kefir, right? You add those microbes into some standard milk. Those microbes start to break down that lactose and milk sugar. They produce the organic acids, but also those microbes start to change the protein structure of the milk proteins. And, you know, there's some really cool research highlighting that, you know, in fermented dairy, they actually have some of these bioactive peptides that don't occur in milk that actually have blood pressure lowering benefits. So when it comes to fermented food, there's so many mechanisms by which they're having these health benefits. And then also, we know obviously that fermentation process in other foods like, you know, wheat, like sourdough, for example, the microbes break down some of that gluten. So some people who have non-celiac gluten sensitivity actually might find that sourdough, you know, is a little bit easier to digest because they don't have as much gluten in it. So it, you know, does all these different things. And I think, you know, that's why it's important that we start to all think, okay, I might not love the taste, although you can train your taste buds to love everything, but actually having some fermented foods in your diet is a really smart thing to do for your gut health.
Now, a lot of people, and this is the conversation I really wanted to get onto with you, compare probiotic supplements and fermented foods. And we often say, maybe as a misnomer, that this food is probiotic rich. And that is something for the layperson just to understand that this contains microbes. But obviously, when we're talking about probiotics in a supplement form, that is different to the microbes or probiotic bacteria found in fermented foods. Can you just help us distinguish the two?
Yeah, look, I mean, it's such an important one, I think, to highlight because I think it's feeding into the misuse of probiotic supplements, right? Where fermented foods is so much more than just those microbes. But actually, you know, in the scientific world, I totally get when we're talking, you know, lay public, we can, you know, say probiotic-like foods. But in the scientific world, that fermented foods just, they don't meet the definition for a probiotic. And the reason for that is if you made kimchi at your house, I made kimchi at my house, the microbial profile, the different microbes in it would actually be quite different. Now, to get the definition or meet the definition of a probiotic, it has to have a specific strain of bacteria that's been sequenced to know the specific benefits, and those benefits need to be shown at a specific dose, which obviously fermented foods, a dose can change, the strains can change, all of that sort of thing. But I think one of the biggest myths around this whole space, right, is the fact that if you are looking for general gut health, fermented foods is what you should be doing, because there has never been a clinical trial showing that any amazing probiotic supplement formulation can help with general gut health, like microbial diversity, right? And there has been, like Stanford University showed that putting people on a high fermented food diet actually did increase their microbial diversity. So I know people just love supplements. It's like, you know, the sexy thing. I'll just take a supplement. I won't worry about fermented foods because probiotic fermented foods and supplement probiotics are the same thing. That's what people I think are doing. And like, oh, I don't like kimchi, so I'm just going to take a supplement. They're very, very different things. Like you highlighted, all those additional things that you get from fermented foods. So for general gut health, go the fermented foods. That's definitely where the science is at. But that's not to say probiotics don't have a role, right? I did my PhD in this space, so I'm so passionate about it, particularly because there actually are international clinical guidelines, right? That, you know, all the scientists are agreeing on, all of the health authorities agreeing on, which is very rare, as you will know, that all scientists are kind of saying the same things around probiotics and that they are very strain and dose specific. So in these international guidelines, they give level 1, like top level 1 evidence that if you have to go on antibiotic for whatever reason, then you should be taking the LGG strain of bacteria. So that's a specific one at a dose of 10 billion units twice a day. So that's how I know a lot of people are like, oh, that sounds quite confused. Which strain of bacteria? But honestly, that's the way we need to use them to have any health benefits. And it's kind of like, vitamins and minerals. If you have iron deficiency, you don't go and take a vitamin D supplement and expect iron to improve, right? They are different things. The same thing about, probiotics. We shouldn't just say go on a probiotic. We need to get to that strain level if we want to replicate, the quite efficacious, results we see in clinical trials around specific strains for specific symptoms or conditions.
So that's almost in essence, if we wanted to say that food could be equivalent to probiotic supplements and to even have anywhere near the claim, which isn't possible right now, an individual supplier of cheese or kefir would have to sequence their food before selling it to say this kefir has this specific genus, species, and strain of bacteria at this specific dose that's aligned with the evidence published to have these effects for IBS or whatever. And obviously, someone selling kefir isn't going to spend the tens of thousands or, hundreds of thousands to do all of that, high level sort of lab assay microsequencing to show that. So like you said, probably good for general health. And if you're just wanting to have good general health, fermented foods are great, and not just take probiotics willy-nilly. If you have a specific issue like bloating for IBS or diarrhea after antibiotics, you can eat fermented foods in addition to something else like a probiotic targeted for that condition. But the fermented foods on their own will not have a clinical effect for a specific function.
100%. And I think the other point to highlight is that for a lot of conditions, there isn't convincing evidence for a probiotic yet, right? So I think that's another area where we've kind of been led to believe that if you want better skin, take a probiotic. Want to cure your IBS, take a probiotic. And I think we need to just be very careful of where there is very robust randomized control trials showing an actual benefit. Because, taking live microbes, they are live microbes. They can actually, change your microbiome in a way that actually might not be that great. So we shouldn't just be taking it as an insurance policy.
Yeah, I think people still need to understand that, when it comes to any sort of supplement, whether it's a multivitamin or even a probiotic, they are powerful chemicals, they're powerful drugs in a sense, and medicines that if used inappropriately could cause some potential harm. I mean, I think, with probiotics, the side effect profile is relatively low, but if we were looking for side effects for inappropriate use of probiotics as a insurance for a healthy person, like you said, I mean, our internal microbiome and ecosystem is delicately balanced with, certain populations of different bugs all in harmony. And if you introduce an overload of one specific type of bug, if they do end up colonizing and don't just get, pooed away, that could disrupt that internal architecture, and you could get more bloating, more cramps, and various other things like that.
And there's actually been a study, it was a small study, but it was a very, I think, important mechanistic study where they looked at, so everyone went on antibiotics and then a group of people just went on an over-the-counter probiotic, like a general multi-strain one, and the other ones didn't have a probiotic at all. And they showed that those who took the multi-strain probiotic, the generic one, their microbiome took longer to reestablish back to baseline compared to those who didn't take anything. So I think, that's kind of the point of like this insurance policy is not a smart thing.
So say someone has a specific targeted symptom that they want some help for with probiotics. They're doing other things as well, dietary changes, but they also want a probiotic. What is the right way for the consumer to go about spotting probiotics?
Yeah, I mean, but even some companies that they've now started to kind of call out, which is so frustrating, like for antibiotics, for example, probiotics for antibiotics, some of the brands don't use the right strains in the clinical guidelines. And I actually went to them, 5 years ago when I set up the gut health clinic, because, I was like, I know that these will be really effective. I want to recommend for this indication. I'm like, these are clinical guidelines. They say you need to use this specific strain to have the benefit. You've just added random ones in. It's like you're giving people iron supplements when they need the vitamin D. And like, oh yeah, but it's too late now. I'm like, no, reformulate. And they wouldn't listen to me. I was so infuriated. So that's why I set up smart strains, because I was like, it's wild that we have these clinical guidelines from health authorities all agreeing this is what we should be giving people. And the ones on the market are just willy-nilly general ones, right? So what I always say to consumers is, if you see a product and like, oh, I'm interested in this, whether it's probiotics or anything, I would say, contact the company and say, has there been a randomized controlled trial, ideally placebo control, because that takes out this brain effect, using that exact, live bacteria formulation, right? Because again, a lot of brands out there are pulling all different strains and then chucking them together, not knowing bacteria can compete, right? If it's never been trialed together. So ask for them, and they should send you the paper. You can check the formulation and the outcome of that paper.
Yeah, I think there is a lot of shadiness going on in the supplements industry in general, but also given the rise of gut health as a trendy viral thing these days, it is good in a sense that people are taking greater ownership of their health, and people like yourself continue to educate people on gut health. But this also opens the doors to charlatans and pseudoscientists to see this as a way to monetize and make money on something which is trendy, but then offering something which doesn't really offer health, but offers more hype. And Megan, just thank you so much for continuing to educate people on gut health in a really simple way.
Thank you. I mean, you're doing an amazing job as well. I think it's all about, empowering people with that right science and just helping people spot the charlatans and, being cautious but excited at the same time, which I know can be difficult, right?
Yeah, actually. And, there's so much more that we haven't covered that I think we'll have to have you around for a round 2 to touch more areas.
I'd love that.